I hope so.
Okay.
Broadcast is live. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Dr. Amy Compton-Phillips. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer at Providence. And just a reminder today that we're going to be talking about clinical research, but this is not medical advice, and this does not mean that we have a medical relationship with people listening. So if you have a specific question about your individual health, please consult your doctor rather than this broadcast. But that said, I'm thrilled to be here today, joined by Dr. Dan Spoon. So Dan, you want to do a quick introduction of yourself, and then I'll talk about our topic?
I love it. Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure. So I'm an interventional structural cardiologist that lives in Missoula, Montana. It's where I was born and raised. So grew up in Montana, spent the better part of 16 years at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and came back home because this is really important to me and this place is really special.
Well, it's great having you here. And actually, the great thing about Providence is we can attract wonderful doctors like Dr. Dan Spoon because we have the Providence Research Network. And the reason we're talking today is it's Clinical Trials Day. The Providence Research Network is a way that we align and organize all of our researchers, all of our doctors, all of our scientists across the entire Providence footprint to actually collaborate in a very effective way on research. We know research is critically important to our mission, that we are practiced day by day. We work on ensuring that we're providing world-class care, right? And putting what's known into practice. At the same time, we have to constantly be looking ahead and discovering what's next. How do we make sure that we're not only doing what's known today, but making sure that we're continuing to advance the science and knowledge behind medicine and medical practice? And could you imagine what would have happened if we hadn't been building up this research muscle when COVID hit? The fact that everything from our ability to rapidly sequence the germ to be able to create things like vaccines based on mRNA technology, a very recently introduced technology, to being able to develop the diagnostic tests and the therapeutics very rapidly. And a huge percentage of the early therapeutic trials were actually done here within the Providence Research Network. And so we contributed significantly to helping actually end the major scourge of COVID for the country and for the world, to be honest with you. So it's actually been incredibly impactful for us to be able to make a difference, be able to aggregate research across our whole footprint. And the work that we did with COVID was just the most recent example of actually the research that we've been doing for years across the Providence family of organization. And that research has been on things like Dr. Spoon is doing in cardiovascular research, as well as in cancer, helping develop the immunotherapy path for so many different cancers that today we're effectively treating, and in some case now winning on tumors, which is really a huge breakthrough. And the fact that we're able to do the same in devices and in neurosciences, in addition to other therapeutic areas. We just recently published, and I believe released today on research.providence.org, our 2021 annual report that explains all the incredible work that we've done in research. And so we're releasing it today because it is Clinical Trials Day. And that's why on 5/20, we're having this conversation. And we actually want to really thank the people that are both doing the trials as well as participating in trials, because without both sides of that coin, we would not be where we are today. And so there will be a link in the broadcast to more information on Clinical Trials Day, as well as on the report. So that said, let's turn it over to the conversation with Dr. Spoon, because that's what we're really here to do. So Dr. Spoon, can you talk a little bit about what's the benefit of clinical trials? What's the benefit for the patients, and what's the benefit for you as a clinician?
Yeah, and I think what I love about clinical trials work is the fact that I think it's the ultimate team sport. And so I've always been an athlete. I enjoy being a part of a bigger whole. And what clinical trials, the only way you can be successful with clinical trials, it starts with a foundation of clinical excellence. So you have to be really good, and the institutions within Providence are, at general clinical care of patients. What is the standard of care? What are we doing there? But we always reach a point where we need more. And so what we have is we've got FDA approved therapies, and there's at some point we don't have enough solutions for the problems. And so that's where clinical trials come in, is once you've sort of exhausted the pathway of FDA approved things, all of the new devices, all of the new therapies are going to be born out of a clinical trial. And so to be an institute that does a lot of clinical trials, it takes an enormous amount of infrastructure. It's not one person doing it. It's from administrative partnerships to clinical excellence to institutional support, and then creating really good relationships with the patients that we treat. Because in the end, it comes down to trust. Patients don't want to be experimented upon. Patients don't want to be looked at as, well, why are we doing this when we should be doing something else? And so developing those areas of trust, creating the systems that Providence has done well, is the only thing that allows us to really advance the science, advance medical knowledge, and push the boundaries on patient care. Because frankly, what we're doing in clinical trials now will become in some part the standard of care down the line for these diseases.
It really is part of creating the future, isn't it?
It is.
So yeah, where do the trials happen? Like, where do patients go? Where do the doctors sit? Where do the nurses sit?
Yeah, and so it is sort of throughout the institution, throughout individual sites. We have clinical trial teams, we have coordinators, and then it all sort of starts with the practitioner in the beginning. And so looking for a solution. And so most of my time is spent in the structural heart space with new valves, with new therapies for the mitral space and the mitral valve, new therapies for the tricuspid space, and percutaneous options. So minimally invasive therapies that can advance what we're doing in the heart valve space. And so as a whole, we've got a clinical team, we've got a research team, and integrating those teams is really important because they are no longer separate silos. And so when a patient comes to our institution, they're evaluated for not only FDA approved clinical therapies, but everybody is looked at for alternative therapies in case they're a better solution or that they don't have clinically available solutions. So it truly is this marriage of the clinical practice in the hospital with the research team. And a lot in the past, these things have remained siloed and sat alone, but we're bringing them together as a full evaluation of the patient using these therapies as adjuncts to what's already available. So at the hospitals throughout Providence, there are so many sites doing wonderful clinical trials in all areas of medicine. And the only way for that to be successful across the institution and an individual institution is these sort of collaborations with the clinical team and the research team.
You know, Dan, I love that example. I graduated med school in 1990. So, you know, like eons ago, back in the dark ages. And the when patients had a leaky aortic valve, they had to come into the hospital, have their chest cracked open, be put on the bypass machine, and have their heart cut open and repaired, right? And I don't know, it was probably a 10-day hospitalization time at that point. Now, how do you do that, right? You do that all through the blood vessels.
So we've in medicine, in cardiology and cardiovascular surgery, created a wonderful concept of the heart team. And what really spurred the heart team on was the development of percutaneous aortic valve replacement, meaning replacing the aortic valve usually through the leg. And so you're evaluated by a cardiac surgeon, by a general cardiologist, by an interventional cardiologist, looking for the right solution. And like you said, if minimally invasive can be as or more efficacious, patients want it. We no longer want large incisions. I don't know if they actually ever wanted them, but it comes to the fact that if we can do it less, reduce stay, and get people back to their activities, that's the goal. And so the revolution that I've watched grow up as I've gone through training has been this shift from everybody was a surgical aortic valve replacement, so doing a sternotomy, cutting out the valve, sewing in a new one, unless they couldn't be for a reason, and then we enrolled them in a trial. And those trials have progressed to the point and FDA approval that we've completely flipped the paradigm. And basically everybody is a percutaneous aortic valve candidate through the leg, unless they're not, and then they're redirected towards the surgical route. So over the last decade, with trials, with patients' dedication, with trusting the therapies, with doing this right, collaborations with industry, we've been able to completely change the paradigm how valves are replaced in the aortic space. And it's been incredible to be a part of.
It's absolutely fabulous. And it really shows the value of what research can do, going from this unbelievably invasive risky procedure to much simpler for people to actually get and recover from. And research is what allowed that to happen. So how do you pick trials? Like, how do you even decide what you're interested in and what you're going to bring into the Providence Research Network to work on?
Well, it's a really good question, and it involves a lot of different components. But sort of when we look at, and this is why Montana is so important to me. Montanans don't want to travel. It's a unique population. We've got a lot of rural areas. And so what we try to do is we pick trials that will augment our clinical practice. So we never want to do something that we don't think is going to be a benefit. It sounds simple, but it's very important to make sure that the patient is the entire reason we're doing the trial. And then how can we augment the therapies we have? And what we see right now in the structural heart space is that we've got wonderful aortic solutions. We still have great surgical solutions for other valves like the mitral and the tricuspid. But what is coming down the path very rapidly is percutaneous through the skin solution for the other valves. And so if somebody isn't a surgical candidate, we used to say, well, we're going to put you on medications and best of luck to you. And the medications can be very effective. But at some point, it requires an anatomic solution. We've got to fix the problem. So a lot of the trials that we're in, and they're the most competitive trials to get in the country because all sites want to be involved in the newest valve-related trials to help their patients. And so some of these sites have only 30 sites in the country. Some will have 80 sites in the world. So that clinical excellence, building those relationships, and then finding what we have that can really augment our practice or take it to the next level and create referrals from a large region. So recently we did a valve replacement trial with cardiac surgery with our interventional cardiologist that has never been performed between Portland and Minneapolis. So creating a new valve therapy in a region that hasn't had it.
It's fantastic. It actually really just opens up the possibility of people in our footprint, anywhere within the Providence footprint, to be able to get the kind of cutting edge care that you're just talking about. Because nobody wants to leave their neighborhood. It turns out that that's not unique to Montana, right?
Yes.
So,
and I think what I'm so impressed about and what I'm so excited about is the infrastructure being put in place to simplify all this. So with a big network like we have, we can streamline these. So I'm one of the 6 IRB directors within our entire system, and we've got a central IRB. So the time where we can be offered a trial and be offering that to patients, we can shorten. Because if we approve a trial at one site, we've got mechanisms now to approve it at multiple sites. Same thing with budgeting and contracting, things that at sometimes large academic centers don't enable you to get involved in a trial for a prolonged period of time and maybe even miss out on the trial entirely. We've been able, through a lot of people's diligent work, through Mary Healy and Lori Skokin and Ari Robichek, and I could name 1,000 different people, but create an infrastructure that physicians like myself can say, we want this trial, and then get it enrolling much quicker, which ultimately benefits the patients.
yeah, I love that we are able to actually get this world-class care close to home through the network effect of working across our entire footprint, which is absolutely fantastic. So can you talk a little bit about, for patients, like, why, if I were a patient, would I want to be part of a clinical trial? What would I need to know? And what are the risk benefits of doing that?
Yeah, and I think it's a wonderful question. And the reason I do, and I'll give you some cancer statistics. And so when people think research, some people automatically say, well, I don't want to be experimented on. Like, this isn't, I want to do this. And it's a very reasonable concern. So one, it starts with a really good communication. 2, the background on some of this is there's so much work that has gone into a new device, a new cancer therapy, before it ever reaches the point of a clinical trial. So one of the things is that, I like these stats, the American Cancer Society said them, is that it's usually around 1,000 potential new medications are screened, evaluated, studied before one arrives at a clinical trial stage. So it's not that we're picking something randomly out and giving that to patient. The next thing is that there's an average of 6 years time in the preclinical, and sometimes much longer, before that medication will be even considered for a clinical trial. So there's been a lot of things that have evaluated safety. There's been a lot of things that have made sure that what we're doing is a safe project. And then there's been some evidence of efficacy. So it's not this coin flip where we say, it might work, it might not work, let's try. We've seen a lot of signs, we've seen a lot of things that have funneled and directed this particular therapy that's not necessarily completely ready for prime time, but it's ready to further evaluate it. So I always start with patients in saying, this isn't something that somebody came up with in their garage a week ago that we're using. There's a lot of data and study. And I think that the United States does this more rigorously than any other country. Our FDA, what we do, and sometimes to patients, frustratingly, the bar to get things to clinical trials in Europe is far lower, not bad, not good, than it is in the United States. And so sometimes that delays our therapies, but it also should give patients a really good confidence that when we're bringing a clinical trial here, an enormous amount of investment has been made to make sure that it is ready for prime time. So I really like to back up and show patients that we've got clinical FDA-approved therapies. Sometimes we've reached our limit, and then we've got an entire population of things that are being evaluated, and only some of those reach the clinical trial stage. So it's already crossed a very high bar before I'm willing to consider it for a patient.
Yeah, one of the things that I always just find really really telling on that kind of the safety of the trial infrastructure in the US is that like thalidomide. Remember back in the day, when thalidomide and the rest of the world was being used for morning sickness, and then it turned out it caused horrible birth defects.
Yes.
Well, it was never approved in the US because actually our trials infrastructure stopped that. So,
yes.
So yeah, it actually does work to help keep people safe, even though we do have to continue to learn. And I think we heard a little bit about this in the news during COVID, in particular, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. Can you just talk a little bit about those? Because some are very, and I want to say earlier experimental trials, and some are really much more advanced. And so if you just describe a little bit about those.
Yeah, no, and I think it's really important. And I won't get into the nitty-gritty details, but as you get from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, we're sort of looking at different things, and our level of confidence continues to go up as you get through those trials. So for something that we have absolutely no therapy for, when COVID came out and we didn't know what it was and we didn't know what we were doing, it makes sense to start offering to that patients at an earlier stage. But when we have already therapies that are pretty efficacious but could be better, to me, it doesn't make as much as sense to offer therapies at an earlier stage. I want to see more data before we offer those to our population. So it becomes, they're all very important steps. They involve different numbers. They're looking at different things. But the further down the line we get, the more confident we are in the outcome. We think we can predict more. But it comes down to the disease. And we see this a lot of times in medicine. Unfortunately, my father-in-law passed away from ALS. And ALS is a disease that we have absolutely no therapies for. And so when we look at those patients, it makes a lot of sense to move the process up and get drugs, get therapies in people, because the alternative is perilous. And so that's where these conversations between practitioners, physicians, what we have, and the patient are so important, because it all comes down to what is the risk and the benefit, and what are we willing to, one, expose ourselves to and expose the patients to. And through conversation and dialogue, we can really get on the same page with that.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And, I think about my friends and colleagues and patients that I've taken care of, particularly with cancer, metastatic cancer,
Yes.
that they're looking at, the alternative is death. And so, right, because metastatic cancer can be a death sentence, depending. Yes. But that if there's a phase 1 trial with an opportunity, and the opportunity might help them, but the opportunity also might be to help other people in the future who have that same cancer. And that's something that they're thinking through. It's like, I don't know if this will help me or not, but it's going to contribute to research that's going to help the next person with the kind of cancer that I have. And so
I've been so impressed with just in medicine, with patients' beneficence and their desire not only to help themselves, but to help the next person that's going through their same thing. And we are so lucky to do what we do, because on a daily basis, we get to see, and in the news and stuff, you hear about all the horrible things, but in clinical practice, you get to see all the beautiful things of somebody saying exactly that. Well, this might not help me, but it might help my neighbor. And those type of things are very real.
Which is fantastic. And actually, it does. We sometimes forget, with all the information in the news, that people are essentially good, and we actually like helping others. And so it's incredibly good to do that. Well, what are some of the trials you're really excited about right now?
Yeah, so in my world and in our space, there is a revolution going on in the mitral space. And so mitral is a much more complex anatomical valve than the aortic. So we talked about that aortic valve earlier through the leg. That's basically a tube. And we were able to solve that problem or improve on that problem with anatomical solutions, with bioengineering in a simpler way. The mitral valve is much more complicated, and it's going to take a more complicated solution. So there are a number of trials that are looking at it in somewhat different ways for non-operative candidates. So still, the number one solution to a really leaky mitral valve is a great mitral valve surgeon doing open heart surgery and fixing that. But as we saw with the aortic valve and going down that lane, the therapies of the future are going to be much less invasive. And so we're being offered a trial that I think is one of the best platforms for mitral valve replacement percutaneously. It's through the vein. You go up, you cross over through the septum, and you implant the valve. And it's called the Intrepid valve, made by Medtronic. And there's so many years that have gone into this. It's restricted in sites. There's very limited sites. And we're going to be offered the site that allows us to do this minimally invasive with a platform I'm very excited about. And I think it has some of the most promise. The other trial we were just offered that I'm really excited about is, so there's a device called an Impella, and the Impella device is a heart pump that we put in through the leg. And one of the biggest limitations to things that we do through the leg is size. And they always come out big, and then as technology improves, we shrink them down, we make them smaller, we make them easier to place. This Impella trial is a huge leap in technology. It's only being offered to 25 sites in the world, and we're one of the 25 sites where we get a device that is much smaller. So instead of a 14 French device, which is sort of larger than a pen, it is a much smaller device. It's 9. It's put in much more easily with much less potential for complication. And when it gets in the body, you can expand it. So it's a revolutionary leap in technology that we're being asked to sort of help pioneer that will help a lot more patients, because there are sometimes I can't use a heart pump because their vessels are too small, because they're too small. And so by miniaturizing this device, it is going to make this much more available to the regular community and populations. And so those are two trials that I'm particularly excited that we've been offered, that we're going to be enrolling in and participating in.
I love that, just the advancements in medications of therapeutics and technology, the devices and the diagnostics, all are just growing by leaps and bounds. But part of that is because there's so much interest right now in health and healthcare. I think that COVID amplified what already was a big part of the entrepreneurial marketplace, right?
Mm.
How do people with an idea and a possible device get the attention and the action and the collaboration of the researchers across the Providence Research Network?
So that's the key, and it's really again a great question. So I'm fortunate enough to be part of a teams that have a number of different patents and a number of devices that we carried through. And one of the things that I've learned is that, one, you need a lot of data. So if you're bringing a device, and Providence has more of that than you can imagine, and I'm always confused, but 52 different hospitals or 55, we've got a huge footprint. We've got a lot of patients. We've got the ability to collect large data. And so when you study things or when you bring them, you need that. The other thing that I think is really important and underestimated is a researcher's ability to connect and collaborate with industry. And I'll tell just a brief story. And so we had a device that could cross an aortic valve better, and we built it on a bench top out of a very Rube Goldberg apparatus at the Mayo Clinic. And we were able to show that, boy, this could work. And then a company came to us and they said, well, we're very interested. They wanted to accelerate the process. And well, a one individual investigator doesn't have the resources or the laboratory space or the bandwidth. One of the questions I had was on nitinol, and it's a metal. And on the nitinol, the question was, how do we make this small enough by creating a nitinol scaffold that will allow us to miniaturize this? And I was thinking about this, and the industry came to me and said, why are you thinking about this? We have 4 PhDs that are specifically nitinol-based scientists. And so by having a big research network, by providing a lot of data, and by having great relationships with industry due to excellence in clinical care, all of these things come together because, as I started this out, it's truly a team sport. We need to advance the science through patient care, through patients willing to be involved, through excellent clinicians, through administrators who understand this, and then add industry in to help accelerate those final things. So I'm not sure that I exactly answered your question, but by bringing ideas in Providence and by Providence collaborating with industry, the future is literally unlimited.
I think you absolutely answered it. And I love that answer. You know, one of the other things that back when I was in the dark ages in medical school and in residency was that most of the research was done at academic organizations, at academic institutions, you know, at the big universities in an urban environment. And today, because I can't say that Missoula, Montana, for those of us sitting in Seattle, would have said that Missoula, Montana is a big academic mecca.
Yeah.
Right. So now we're really able to distribute knowledge and information and discovery into areas of the country that may or may not have in the past been able to have access to these kinds of clinical trials. And we're taking advantage of the brilliant minds and big hearts of the people that live in the areas that might be outside of a major urban academic institution, who are also brilliant clinicians and patients who want to be able to participate. So can you talk a little bit about the growth of research across Providence and specifically in Montana, and how you're actually able to take advantage now that because of the Providence Research Network and the access to that entire team, that you're growing the profile and portfolio?
Yeah, and you're exactly right. So I think in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, industry only really wanted to collaborate with the cachet of large academic institutions. But what we found is the paradigm is almost completely flipped, and they still want large academic centers to participate. But more importantly than that, they want excellent communication. They want nimbleness that a large system like this with separate entities allows for. And so what I've been so impressed with and fortunate to help participate in is truly, I'm a big system fan. And so if you can create systems that allow us to simplify, to replicate, and to streamline processes, well, then we're already 50 yards down the field. And I think that's what Providence has been able to do so well, is from visionary people at the leadership level to local people and the collaborations that they've had. And I know I mentioned this earlier, but one of the things, and I've been fortunate to be recruited to a number of large academic centers over the last couple of years, and what they continue to say is, we want you to do here what you're doing there. And I continue to say, well, the infrastructure is quite different. And something as simple as IRB approval, so Institutional Review Board approval, the Institutional Review Board makes sure that whatever we're doing meets guidelines and has the patients first, and is really sort of it's the filter with which we do research to make sure everything's being done above board. There are places that you can't get an Institutional Review Board decision for 6-8 months a year. Budgeting and contracting at some large institutions has to go through the Attorney General office in that state. And so what Providence has been able to do, and very forward thinking, is combine these entities and make them available to the entire system. And so we're fortunate in Missoula to review the majority of the cardiovascular trials throughout the system. So we've got cardiovascular experts. We can turn these trials around quickly, and then we can approve them at multiple institutions simultaneously, where a lot of places can't. And so sometimes when people think, oh, it's a big institution, it might be slow and there might be some hurdles to go through, it's been exactly the opposite. And what we're pushing now is, so I've been offered a number of trials that they want satellite centers. So we've created a research infrastructure. We've got great clinical coordinators. We've got people that are expert. And some of the sites don't have as mature of a research infrastructure. But industry has come and said, well, why don't you guys run this trial, but offer it to 3 other sites that you can oversee and they can have the therapy? And things like that have never been available to sites without an advanced research program. And that all comes from the collaborative nature of our network and creating the systems that will allow those to happen. So I'm so excited about the future of this moving forward, because what has been created in Providence will continue to evolve. And I think the sky's the limit.
Well, I cannot have said any of that better myself. You know, you really are bringing to life what we had this idea of how do you get academic level cutting edge care, but it close to home for people who need it and who want to participate and who want to be part of it. And the clinicians, the doctors and the nurses who care for them, we really wanted to be able to match up what our vision is of health for a better world with the fact that that health belongs in every community across the country.
Yeah.
And so love the fact that you've been able to bring that to life. Is there anything else that I should have asked you today, Dan? Because I personally, you're gonna send me off into my weekend with a big smile on my face so far.
No, the opportunity to do this and the opportunity to be a part. I look at myself and I've always looked at it as I want to be a facilitator. I want everybody to get more opportunities. And so I think that what Providence has done is outstanding. I think that the horsepower with which we can bring this to the communities is sort of unparalleled. And this is just one aspect of amazing research that's going on here from basic science that's going on at different places, that we've got amazing large data that is sort of changing the way things are done. And so my view of clinical trials dovetails nicely. It helps continue to do what we all went into medicine for, is solve problems that otherwise people wouldn't have therapies for, to do it locally, to create relationships that are special. And I couldn't be more impressed with the infrastructure and the support that I've been given to sort of run with this. And so without every component of this team, we've got amazing administrators locally and at the system level, from Joyce Dombrowski to Jim McKay to Chrissy Peterson. There are so many people that this takes, and I can have energy and an idea and enthusiasm, but without that team, none of this happens. And so I think I will leave you with this, that I couldn't be more excited about where we've come, and I couldn't be more excited about the future, because I foresee Providence continuing to take steps in even more leadership throughout this country because of the systems and the infrastructure which have been built.
Well, I am so delighted to hear that. You know, our job is really to try to make the right thing easy to do for everyone. And in this case, making the right thing easy to do and bringing world-class care close to home. And so I want to thank you so much, and do want to invite everybody to go to research.providence.org and take a look at the actual annual plan and that report on how we've done research, everything that Dan talked about today in actually bringing it forward into the story, and actually showing the performance and the fact that our reputation of the Providence Research Network has been built by people that we have doing the research, bringing cutting edge care close to home today. So thank you all. Truly appreciate it. Happy Clinical Research Day, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.